Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I am Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Analysis. This week, George Friedman sat down with Leighton Smith. Some of you might remember that George sat down with Leighton for a two-part series back in January. They are back at it again to talk about everything that is going on in the world. Obviously, there's plenty to talk about. Before we get on to George and Leighton, just wanted to encourage all listeners to, if you haven't already, please check us out at geopoliticalfutures.com. With all of the conflict between the United States and China over the trade war, we've got a couple great pieces up about that, especially one that was published by my colleague Philip Orchard just a couple days ago. Also wanted to give a shout out to Xander Snyder, who is a frequent guest on this podcast and who wrote a really exceptional piece about how climate change is affecting Iran and how that's intersecting with the resilience and stability of the political regime there. So without further ado, here's George and Leighton, and we'll see you out there.
Now, George Friedman, the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures, welcome to the podcast. Good to talk.
Good to talk to you.
I want to go back to January, where you published on January 2nd, welcoming the new year, with an article entitled "What Has Happened to Us? The global system that many fear is dying is already dead. The new one has yet to emerge." What has changed? What might have changed since then?
Well, the old system began with the end of World War II. It was a system that assumed that everyone has a common interest in avoiding war, and a system that assumed that free trade was always the best thing. 2008 put a bullet in the head of the second idea, because it was discovered that free trade allowed some nations to take advantage of others, or some classes within a nation were hurt. And then other nations, particularly the United States, start asking the question, why are we committed to defense of this country or that country? Why are we in NATO and stuff like that? So the multilateral system that emerged after World War II died. The assumption that it's always better to be in an alliance system became questionable. And the idea that free trade is always what you want to see also became dubious.
It was you said America started to ask questions about that. Was it America, or was it? I know they're one and the same, but was it Trump-driven?
Well, I mean, the real countries that started to ask the question were the Europeans. They were in NATO. NATO was a military alliance. They had no militaries. So the idea was that they could have their security guaranteed by the United States, but not have any reciprocal capability, let alone obligation. That's where it started, because for the United States, well before Trump, the question became, why are we committed to spending almost 4% of our GDP when the Europeans can't even spend 2% of their GDP on defense? And Trump simply came in and put a fine point on that. It said, look, this is an institution that is obsolete. And everybody went into an uproar, of course, over how could he say that? But he was saying something that many Americans were thinking. And much of what Trump is doing is not new to Trump. What's new is the rhetoric that surrounds it and the direct action that he takes where others merely threaten it.
All right, a lot of Americans were thinking this, but let me throw around a couple of phrases. You know, the military-industrial complex, the elite, etc. Were any of them part of that thinking?
Well, certainly those, Lockheed Martin and companies like that benefited from selling weapons, wanted to go on as it was. But no one ever questioned whether the United States should remain armed. The arms are going to be sold. No one questioned the continuation of the American military. They simply questioned whether or not the United States should have an automatic commitment to every European country that was in NATO, or whether it was going to be selective in what it did. I mean, what it learned since 9/11 was that there are wars that we cannot win, that no allies can help us, and we'd better stay out of it. And this is where, the notion of America first came. It really isn't a fair notion, but what Trump was saying to the campaign is, You can't fight a war for 17 years, not win it, and have as your only strategy in the 18th year.
Well, actually, if the alternative candidate had have won, if President Clinton was now calling the shots as best as she could, would this scenario be any different?
The rhetoric would be different, but the United States, the U.S. military was exhausted. Our bombers had been driven to the ground. Our troops, my daughter, had served years in Iraq. She couldn't continue it. I mean, if she could, if she had, there would have been tremendous resistance against that. So much of what Trump did is what he had to do. He was the typical president who really wasn't altogether clear on what his policy was, but he knew which way the wind was blowing and he went with it. Hillary Clinton would have gone the same way, but she would have been blown backwards.
Well, let me ask you a hypothetical question, another one, I suppose. That is, with the weakening of the military, was that not an opportune time for other states to take advantage?
Well, I said exhaustion, exhaustion by the troops and so on and so forth. And it takes about a year and a half to recover from exhaustion. It was not that we were weakened. Other nations did attempt to take advantage of it, but failed. I mean, the Chinese did in the South China Sea and have thus far failed to achieve any of their goals there. The Russians threatened various things and finally invaded a country we didn't care about, they didn't care about, Syria. So, yeah, there were things that could be done, but the United States remains an overwhelmingly powerful nation. The issue here was how do we sustain that in a manageable way? 17 years of war is not manageable. And secondly, what is our strategy? Who are we committed to? Who are our friends? What is the price of friendship for the United States? In other words, where other nations would come and ask the question, do we really want to be allied with the United States? The United States was now asking the question, do we really want to be allied with you? And that became very frightening to other countries.
On that particular basis, let's get local. Where would New Zealand be considered to be in the friendship stakes?
Well, we don't think much about New Zealand, as you know. We do think a great deal about Australia. Australia is a critical relationship, and so is New Zealand, part of that, because, of course, there's the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are a very real alliance system, the British, the Canadians, the Americans, the Australians, and the Kiwis. And we don't do more in that alliance than just share information. I mean, we also are engaged in various operations in the Pacific, for example, together, and in the Atlantic together. So if you go to a base in Britain, you'll see American officers there. You go to a base in the United States, you'll see Australian officers there. The Five Eyes is an alliance structure that's totally informal and based simply on, hey, we have a common past and we need each other. And we don't really like each other necessarily all that much, although we do. But, we each have our quirks, but we have to, of necessity, work together.
What do you mean we really don't like each other very much, but we do?
Well, the Canadians don't like the Americans. Lots of Australians don't like the Americans. I mean, we're the big guys, so we're the ones we don't like. Everybody gets fed up with the British occasionally. We get very irritated, the Canadians. It's like a marriage. It's, we're not going to get divorced, but we certainly have serious problems. Actually, the country probably we have the least problems with is Australia, but I think Australia has problems with us.
Well, there are underlying problems everywhere at the moment, all over the planet, it seems to me. I read something last night that you'd written a few weeks ago with regard to China. And in conversation in China last year, something came up. I don't have it in front of me, but something came up about what does China want? What does America want? What do the Chinese, what do the Americans want? And one aspect of it that was mentioned was America wants China to understand that America controls the Pacific. America is in charge of the Pacific. How's that playing out?
Quite well. The South China Sea is surrounded by a string of islands, so is the East China Sea. It is very easy to blockade the Chinese. The Chinese are terrified that the United States will blockade China. And this is part of the tariff issue because both of them are blockades in a certain sense, in certain different ways. The Chinese want to dominate South China Sea and move out into the Pacific. The United States does not want them to dominate the South China Sea because they may well move into the Pacific. We fought a war with the Japanese over who would control the Pacific. We won. We're an island. North America is an island. It's a large island, but it still depends on control of the seas to assure its national security. So we're not going to give up the Pacific. We can have all the moral or legal questions. We are the dominant military power. The Chinese pressed on us for that. And one of the reasons for the American tariffs, which people don't quite understand, is this is partly a response to the Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. We're showing them that not only do we have a military capability in the area, but we also have an economic capability. We have the advantage of being the customer. They have the disadvantage of being the seller.
I saw a short little video, and I don't know who it was. It was a young guy. He could have even been Sri Lankan because he made a lot of reference to Sri Lanka. The video went for about 3 minutes, and it was to do with China buying up countries by lending money, and it's a very well presented little number that was quite spooky if you recognise the results. That China puts money into countries, Sri Lanka, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, etc. And over a period of time, these countries can't pay back what they have been loaned, and so they lose the properties, they lose control of the properties that have been built, the infrastructure, the airports, the highway, whatever, to China. And this is just like a bank lending you money to buy a house, and you can't pay back the mortgage, and so the bank takes the house, and you move out. Comment?
Well, the problem is that the Chinese can be dealt with very simply, seize their property. So the problem of investing in foreign countries, as the United States has learned several times over, is that once you own that port, you can't pick it up and take it home. And once a government comes in and says, I don't recognize your title to this port, there's very little you can do except go to war over the port, which most countries, including China, won't do. So on the one hand, it looks like China is buying the world. From my point of view, it looks like China is desperately trying to invest anywhere but in China, even if that property they're buying might be confiscated by the host country. The Chinese are spending a tremendous amount of money outside of China. That's an indication of how bad the Chinese economy is. Because if the Chinese economy were as good as the Chinese claim it is, you'd be a fool to invest somewhere else. So this is partly, it could be seen as China buying the world. It also could be seen as China desperately trying to move money, particularly private money, out of China, fearing what's going to come, and accepting that maybe they won't let them sell it.
Okay, the Chinese invested in this country individually in housing in particular, and that has stalled quite severely and has affected the housing market. But this week, we learned that Chinese are spending. Now you might say that in international terms this isn't very much, but it's a fair whack for New Zealand. Chinese investors are spending $11 billion over the next few years. Some of it's already underway in this country, in New Zealand, in various investments, apartment blocks, very large ones, in hotels, etc., infrastructure for tourism, you might say. Should we be at all concerned about that?
Well, firstly, the Chinese have not invested. They said they're going to invest. In Chinese,
well, some of it's underway.
Sure. Look, the Chinese will happily put their money in any country that will allow them to keep it. They're living in a country where they're afraid this money is going to be confiscated. So there's necessarily a desire to buy property elsewhere. But when I was visiting New Zealand a while ago, one of the discussions was how to put a stop to the inflation in housing prices because the Chinese buy property simply in order to own property. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that every one of those Chinese investors is at risk because depending on what the New Zealand Parliament and people decide, there may be actions taken that reduce the value of that property and they lose money. So the risk that the Chinese have whenever they invest in a country like New Zealand is now they're subject to New Zealand laws. And those laws change, particularly when New Zealanders lose their advantage.
New Zealand, though, China is our biggest trading partner. New Zealand could easily be, well, let's put it bluntly, economically blackmailed on the other side of the equation.
That's entirely possible. I'd have to examine very carefully what the Chinese are selling to China, whether they can sell elsewhere.
You mean what the New Zealanders are selling to China?
I'm sorry, what the New Zealanders are selling to China, whether New Zealand can sell it elsewhere. And also ask the question, in 5 years, will the Chinese be able to buy this stuff? Because your customer, China, has deep economic problems that preceded the sanctions of the United States that arose from 2008. It is a country that is addicted to exports in a world that is more resistant to exports undermining their own economies. And so one of the things that New Zealand should ask is China a reliable customer in the future, or is there some sort of urgency in diversifying?
So let me ask you then, these deep economic problems that China has, can you summarize them in 3 or 4 points?
Well, two elements. One, China used to export about 40% of its GDP. That's down to what they claim is only about 20%. They have not absorbed the others internally. They can't. They're a poor country. And therefore, the amount of money flowing in has declined. On the other side of the equation, China has a huge, overwhelming debt crisis. The Chinese did not lend based on economic interest, but on political interest. Those who were well connected got loans. Those that didn't get loans. Now with this crisis in exports, many of those loans are not going to be repaid. So these are the two basic dimensions. And you have the problem that the interior of China is an extraordinarily poor area of the world. The coastal region where you trade is wealthy, and the tension between the two parts of China are substantial. So like in any country or any customer you have, you really have to look at their credit ratings. And the problem that New Zealand has with China, as it had with Japan before it, is an assumption that its appetite will always be there. You're wondering what the Chinese will do to harm you. The biggest thing they can do to harm you is not being able to pay their bills.
Well, if we go back to the late 80s, people were worried about Japan buying up everything, just like we've been going through with China. I never was for the same reason that you put before, that you can't pick up the Regent Hotel as it was then in the middle of Auckland and take it out of the country, and the Japanese owned it. And so when the time came, they had to sell it when they needed to. Same principle to China.
The same principle in the sense that why were they buying hotels in New Zealand instead of Japan? It's the insider trading rule. Do what the insiders do. And the insiders were selling Japan and buying New Zealand. The insiders in China are buying New Zealand, selling China. By that transaction, that's the indication of a country where the insiders know they're in trouble.
Just one more thing on that part of the world, Hong Kong. There's a bit of an issue at the moment with Hong Kong folk who are very unhappy. They're demonstrating in the streets, lots of them. Could that explode into what?
Well, I mean, obviously it could have exploded into an insurrection, but it can't be a successful one. I mean, it is a Chinese city. The Chinese military can control it and occupy it whenever they want. The Chinese are terrified that the values of Hong Kong are going to move into China proper. They're extremely nervous about popular opinion. They have created massive security devices. This is a government that's afraid of what the economic consequences are going to do to loyalty inside of China. And Hong Kong is going to be pressed hard, and I don't think they have anywhere to go.
All right, so Tiananmen Square has just been celebrated, an anniversary. Could Hong Kong turn into another Tiananmen Square?
It's very difficult to imagine the Hong Kong public as being willing to resist the Chinese to the point where the Chinese would have to intervene. But what can happen there is the Chinese will increasingly press the Hong Kong system to become much more like the rest of China. And they'll even,
Yeah, go
but
on.
their problem with this is Hong Kong is economically successful. They need the revenue from Hong Kong. They fear the politics of Hong Kong. And this is just another place where the Chinese are facing problems.
All right. An update on Brexit from your perspective. Who knows where this is going to go, but it's got to go. I suppose it's got to go in one direction. It's just a matter of the finite examination of it. UK survival is something I think is very questionable.
Well, first we have to recognize that in the worst case scenario, at least 40% on either side want the opposite thing. Now, in an election, that's a big spread, but the fact is that they are bitterly opposed. Britain has become a country deeply divided. England has. The Scots appear to be prepared to remain at this moment inside, but extraordinarily, we could not imagine 20 years ago Scottish independence being taken seriously. The Northern Ireland question has once again emerged, at least in a small way. There's been at least one killing. So what this entire Brexit thing has done is it doesn't matter at this point whether Britain remains in the EU or doesn't. Britain is now a deeply angry, divided country. Its parts are hostile to each other, and a great deal of this had to do with the behavior of the European Union in being absolutely inflexible and unwilling to recognize the fact that here is the second largest economy in Europe. It is undergoing a tremendous political trial, and the EU made it as hard as possible to solve that problem. It's really an extraordinary thing to watch.
Is Europe strong, or is Europe, shall we say, weakening in its power?
Well, the European Union, which is what we mean by Europe, is facing the second largest economy in turmoil, Britain. The third largest economy, Italy, prepared to default on its debts. A hostile relationship between the EU and Poland, between EU and Hungary, between the EU and Greece. I mean, you see, if you go back to 2007, the year before 2008 occurred, 2007, nothing like this was expected. Nothing like this could be predicted. And this is not a weakening, it is a fragmentation going on.
Well, you say wasn't expected. I am surprised that Europe has lasted, the European Union has lasted as long as it has, and I still expect it's going to fracture fairly severely in the not too distant future. But I've been waiting for that to happen, like I've been waiting for an international economic crisis for a few years too.
Well, in this case, it has happened. It just nobody wants to see it.
Yeah. Now, I know that you're on the verge of going to Romania, a place that you have spent a bit of time in of recent period. I'm interested. I've only been to Romania once. It was very brief. It was like a fly in, get on a riverboat, and row out. I'm interested in your thoughts on Romania for a couple of reasons. One of them personal. In that Romania only was released from totalitarianism a relatively short time ago, along with a lot of other countries in that part of the world. How is it progressing?
Well, it has not managed to solve the basic problem of corruption. It is still divided between a large Hungarian area in Transylvania and a Romanian area, and the Hungarian area would like to become independent. But what is most interesting is that it has become a vital ally of the United States. The United States bases aircraft there. The United States bases ships there. It is the American key to the Black Sea. So on the one hand, it has not really solved its problems. On the other hand, it's benefiting from the fact that the United States tends to be extremely generous when with an lie, with a lot of technology transfer. So my own company uses a Romanian firm for IT purposes, and that's more likely to help than any of the other political programs by others.
I'm interested in what you've just said. I still think suspiciously of Iranian technology intention, if you want, for the for the amount of shall we say theft that came out of it or comes out of it. Has that well, corruption, if you want to use the word, is that still relevant?
Yeah, but I mean, you have somebody in New Zealand at this moment. I don't know his name. I have no idea who he is. Who's stealing information? This has become a universal problem. The difference is in Romania they found them.
And so there's no more. Well, none at the moment.
No, there will always be. I mean, look, the internet is inherently insecure. It was not built for anything mission critical. They're trying to build a security around it, but it's not working very well. In the meantime, we all know that if we have something important, put it in a yellow pad. If you don't put it in a yellow pad, somebody's going to take it.
I think today I shall go and buy a yellow pad. Great talking to you. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks, I think. And in the interim, happy trails.
I'm off. The car's here.
George Friedman, founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. And by the way, if you look up Geopolitical Futures at the moment, there's some very interesting free stuff there, and I can tell you it's well worth the very small cost, in my opinion, the very small cost of subscribing to it. Geopoliticalfutures.com.